Hey guys, I'm back. I can't believe that it's been about a year since I uploaded, and for that, I'm sorry. Honestly, it's unforgivable. But I have been doing writing for Valimerence, and I'm excited to share some of the projects that I've been working on. Today, I'm going to read for you guys a little one-off story that I wrote called The Dark Fae in the Woods. This is just a one-chapter story, and I don't really think that I'll be doing any writing for this one in the super near future. I might turn this into like a bigger story, but for now it's just a cute little story to fall asleep to. So I hope that you enjoy it and that it helps you to relax. The wood was silent, except for her footsteps on the crunchy snow and the droplets of melting ice falling from the trees. Then there was a raven cawing to her right. Although the stillness of the quiet wood would have been unnerving to some, for Vive it didn't feel like she was alone. She always felt at peace when she walked in these woods, as if she was watched over. She passed by a melting creek. The temperature that day was warm for the middle of December, and the ice and snow were soft and yielding. Throughout the year, she came to this wood often. The changing of seasons was relaxing and showed the passing of time, even when the workdays seemed like they were all the same. The 4 seasons helped her keep track of all that had been accomplished and grounded her to the earth when it was so easy to be swept up in modern-day life. Before she came to live in this town, the year would pass by in a blur, but now that she was in this small, close-knit town, she felt as though there was more liveliness and wholeness to her days. Everyone said that this town was different, but Vive never thought they'd been telling the truth. They said that creatures lived in the woods, and that if you left your window open on a summer night, the pixies would come tie your hair to your bedpost. They said that the spring petals that fell as the season turned to summer would be swept up into the wind and create shadows of a girl. They said that hobgoblins took children's lost baby teeth. They said some fae loved to take babies and replace them with changelings who looked exactly the same but were wholly not. They said the fae would come from a different world. They said that if you walked in the woods, you were surely to see something you couldn't quite place, and all you knew was that it was odd. Vive moved to Willow's Reign because her grandmother had willed her an estate. She'd come here before, many times when she was growing up, and her grandmother would tell her the little legends that the town perpetuated. As she explored the town's shops, the little old ladies were more than happy to share the tales that spooked newcomers, but she and her mother had always compartmentalized the tales as just that, tales. Now, as she walked through the woods, she paid no mind to the suspicions and fears and hopes of the townspeople. Instead, she walked as if she were in a story. Of course, she wished the stories were true, just like everyone else, because if they were true, then there was something out there that was more mystical and magical than us. It somehow gave purpose to life. Instead, she actually believed that there was nothing like that out there. She couldn't make herself believe anything other than that, but she could imagine, and she could almost trick herself into seeing fantastical visions in the woods. Little squirrels that almost looked like a hobgoblin, a leaf floating to the ground that could pass as a maple fairy. The experiences were many, but always explained away by the most logical answer. But this day was different. Somehow, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Of course, everyone had those feelings when they walk alone, but this day it was quite apparent, creeping in the back of her mind. A little warning that there was something powerful just behind her. But every time she took a glance around, the wood was empty, save for the little squirrel that scampered up a tree, or a woodpecker chipping away at bark. Vive could feel something, as if in her mind, a little tapping, her senses telling her that there was something there. Vive quickly turned around, and in the blur of her movement, as her eyes tried to focus, she thought, amidst the scattered trees, that she saw a man. Before she could catch a good glimpse, it was as if he vanished. She told herself this was exactly what the townspeople have done, making up visions. However, she couldn't shake the thought that she knew she saw something. She settled at her favorite spot, a little stump in the woods that overlooked the snow-laden forest. She liked the feeling of being in the middle of nowhere, lost within space. It was so different from the city she was used to. She didn't know how long she was going to be here, in this town, at her late grandmother's home. On the one hand, she hoped to stay for a long time. It was peaceful and felt oddly right. But on the other hand, she knew that she should probably sell the house and get on with her life in the city. Vive cleared the stump of snow and laid her blanket on top. Out of her pack, she took out her books and prepared for a nice afternoon of getting lost in imagination. And so she did. She got lost until the winter sun was low in the sky and the gray clouds were darkening. She awoke from her lost thoughts and realized how late it had become, and that the snow was steadily falling from the sky, little puffs floating downward till they disappeared among the collective white. Then she felt it, again, that same feeling, the instinctual knowing that the hunted was being watched by a predator. Although it didn't quite scare her, maybe she should have been afraid. Maybe she was stupid for not realizing the danger. Instead, she felt rather peaceful, as if whatever it was looking out for her. She left that day, but kept returning all throughout the season. What was curious to her was that every time she felt the presence there with her, but she never quite caught a glimpse of it. Every time she thought she caught it, it just became a blur, and then was gone. It was now the middle of February, cold and dangerous, but somehow she liked that. She liked pushing the boundaries because it made her feel alive. Today was not a good day to be so reckless, as if any day was. She hadn't felt the rise of the hair on the back of her neck that told her someone was watching, but she wished it would happen. As she walked on a freshly snow-laden path, she hadn't anticipated the decline of the hill and the slippery sheet of ice beneath the clean snow. Her foot slipped out from underneath her, and she fell hard. The fall would have been survivable enough. However, the decline of the hill kept her barreling down, and she couldn't stop the acceleration. She was twisting and gripping at the ground, but the ice was too thick to hold onto anything solid. Instead, she kept gaining speed, and soon she neared the end of the hill, spinning out and hitting her head on a solid tree. She awoke to a shadow above her. In her dazed state, it almost seemed as if the shadow was moving in the wind, phasing and liquid. As her eyes adjusted, she realized that was fabric. But her eyes had not been wrong. It was oddly interacting with the environment, something she'd never seen any fabric do before. It was black as midnight and shifting in the wind, and as her eyes traveled up, she realized it was some sort of cloak. Her eyes kept traveling upward, and they finally found a face, a beautiful, angular, elven face. Although he was beautiful in an unearthly way, there was a harshness to his features. His skin was pale, and it was a stark contrast against his dark hair. His eyebrows were worried and angry, and his eyes were cold and defined, as if he was looking right through her. His lips were in a tight line, and she wasn't sure if it was to keep from talking or to intimidate her further. Yet, she wasn't afraid of him, because he seemed oddly familiar. Finally she spoke, and rose her hand to her aching head. "How long have I been out?" She sounded a lot clearer than she thought it would come out. There was a silence for a long while. Then finally he responded, his tone angry. "Not long." "Okay," she said back, trying to get up. She knew she should probably ask more, but currently she couldn't quite put together all the questions she should ask. As she struggled to get up, the man came to her aid, one hand steadying her waist and the other on her shoulder. "Steady," he said, and it was more comforting than she thought he'd be capable of. "Thank you. I think I have a concussion." She looked up into his eyes and saw a flicker of something. Was it pain? He paused, and then his hand came up to the wound on her head. His touch was gentle, but the throbbing and sensitivity of the injury made any touch magnified. Vive flinched slightly, and her eyes immediately flicked to his. She winced at the sight of his eyes hardening again. "You are fragile," he said through gritted teeth, as if resenting her humanness. "Yeah, I guess I am," she laughed, still gazing at him. She was surprised that she could even look at him for as long as she had been. His looks were so striking that she was sure most people couldn't look at him for very long. Maybe she wasn't intimidated because her head felt broken and dizzy, or because she felt she knew him somehow. His expression changed at her carefree reaction. He looked confused. "You should be more careful," he said, as he looked away from her and studied her wound. Vive just smiled, somehow, in all his brooding stature that boasted of his power. He had an innocence to him. Vive couldn't help but blurt out her next thought. "Have I met you before?" And as his eyes met hers again, a flash of worry crossed his face. "No," he replied curtly before turning his face away. "Are you sure?" Vive wiggled to reach his eyes again.
Yes.
Yes, we've met? She giggled, knowing that she was pushing his buttons, but somehow she knew he'd never hurt her. He just gave her a look with his darkened eyes, and she asked herself, did they just flare? Her hand came up to his face and caressed his warm skin. She thought it would be cold because of his coloring, but instead it warmed her chilled fingers. The stranger, despite himself, leaned into her touch. She smiled, thinking that he reminded her of a cat or some sort of wild animal. I know you, she said, before a wave of dizziness came over her and she fell into his hard frame, losing consciousness. The stranger stiffened as he held her, but then melted as he felt the warm puffs of air on his neck. Vive woke in a room that was not hers. She was atop a bed of velvet, with translucent fabric draping the tall bedposts. The room surrounding her was large and filled with furniture that reminded her of a Victorian era. The walls were black and trimmed in gold, which was reflecting the light coming from glowing globes that were placed at the four corners of the room. They were spheres held up on metal stands, and the light they produced lit the room to a dim level. Then Vive's eyes landed on the figure working at a small table across the room. Tall frame, dark hair, and silent. Then, as if he could sense her eyes, he turned. She was met with the face of the man she'd met in the woods, and she felt relief at his presence. Hi, she said, unsure of what else to say.
You're hurt. Lay down,
was the Fae man's reply, and Vive frowned. I will if you tell me who you are, she bargained, a slight grin on the side of her mouth.
No.
She knew it was a long shot, since she had a good idea of what he was, and they don't say their names easily. She continued, Then, where am I? He began walking towards her, a bowl of something in his hands.
You are at my home.
Am I still on Earth? Vive questioned, thinking back to the stories of where the Fae had come from.
Yes, my home is in the woods.
No, she replied quickly. I've been just about everywhere in the woods. There is no house. She was confident in her statement, but the slight grin on his face made her waver, not only because in that one look she knew she was wrong, but also because it was the most devastatingly handsome expression on him she'd seen yet.
You've gone past my house many times,
he said, humor lacing his tone. He sat down on the bed, and she became even more aware of his presence.
So,
I just can't see it.
Correct,
he confirmed as he took her face and turned it slightly so he could take another look at her wound. How did I not run into it? She laughed, picturing herself hitting an invisible wall.
Because you cannot enter the grounds unless I let you.
But, she started, but he continued.
The enchantment would just lead you to walk around it. You were not aware of it.
That would be funny to watch, she giggled.
I guess it was,
he grinned. So then, she paused as he took some salve from the bowl and spread it over her wound with his thumb. The feel of his proximity and his gentle touch disarmed her. She hoped he didn't notice her breathing pick up, but she doubted she was that lucky.
"Yes?"
he prompted, with a smirk on his lips and a dangerous look in his eyes. "You've seen me before, then? You're the one who's been following me?" She asked the last part in almost a whisper. He was silent for a while, but then said,
"You come to the woods often."
"Yes, but—"
"You shouldn't walk alone,"
he said sternly, and the hand that was not attending to her wound came over her neck. It partly seemed as if he was trying to keep her in place, but also as if he was trying to get his point across, that she was powerless and weak. "I wasn't alone," Vive said, her eyes pointedly meeting his, and she couldn't tell if it was fury or humor that danced in his eyes.
"I'm not the only one in the woods."
His voice was reprimanding, as if she were a child, but Vive came back at him quickly. "But you're the most powerful one." She was so sure of the truth in her statement, and his refusal to reply confirmed it. His expression was heated and fiery. His hands caressed the sides of her face, and her hearing was muffled as his thumbs traced her rounded ears. Vive's eyes flitted to his, which were pointed and regal. He continued his appreciation, and it was as if he couldn't believe he was touching her.
"You are seriously hurt."
His voice was pained and angry.
"If I hadn't been there—"
His voice trailed off. And then he hardened his expression once again, stony and cold.
"You're all healed now. You'll go back in the morning."
He moved to get up, but Vive caught his arm. What do I call you?" Her eyes were pleading for him to open up again, for this to not be a dream.
"Rowan,"
he replied, as if he couldn't help but tell her, and then he gently pushed her down to the bed so she could sleep. A longing in the pause, suggesting he wanted to stay. Instead, he turned, and as he walked to the door, he said,
"Sleep, Vive."
Vive woke in the same room. She felt rested and awake, which told her that indeed none of it had been a dream. The door opened, and a small woman with large eyes and too small of features entered the room.
"Good morning, my lady."
She looked apprehensive.
"I will see to it that you get back, but first you must bathe and dress and eat."
"Ah, thank you. But where's Rowan?"
"The master had to go out. He will not return for a while."
The servant's eyes darted to the side as she spoke, and busied herself with opening a drawer and pulling out a robe.
"You mean he didn't want to see me off?"
Vive sounded accusing, because she was.
"Master does not have time for those things. I will see to it."
Her eyes flashed to the window. Vive's mind was racing, and then she remembered something she heard about the Fae. They can't lie. Vive chose her words carefully. "Where is Rowan?" The servant looked nervously to the window and said,
"He is not here."
Vive interrupted her by getting out of bed and stomping out of the room. The hallway was lit with daylight streaming from the tall windows, which momentarily blinded her. When her vision cleared, she saw that she was in the middle of the hall, and could choose either way to search. She chose to the right and found herself on a balcony that led to a double staircase. It overlooked a large sitting room, and to the right of that room was a massive doubled door. The servant followed behind her, her tiny frame trying to keep up as Vive stomped down the stairs. "Rowan!" Vive shouted, angry that he was getting rid of her, as if last night the feelings she knew was there hadn't happened. She knew that if she let the servant take her home, she'd never see Rowan again. "Rowan!" She ran to the doors and pulled them open, a gust of winter air assaulting her. She wasn't wearing shoes, but she stepped out into the snow anyway. "Rowan, I know you're out here," she shouted into the open air. The estate was indeed in the middle of the woods, and was larger than she thought it would be. The Victorian-style estate was complete with a long lawn, large hedges surrounding the manor, angled stained-glass windows, and a cobblestone path. Vive ran to the back of the mansion. The cobblestone path led to steps descending to a fountain, and then further to a great gazebo. It was structured in a green metal and clear with glass for walls. Its domed shape was swirled with metal flowers, caging in the man who was sitting inside the beautiful prison. "Rowan!" Vive called out again, running to him. He turned, an anguished expression on his face, as if he'd heard her call out one too many times. Then he saw she was without shoes, and he quickly exited the gazebo, coming to her without resistance. "You should be dressed," he chastised, picking her up off the snowy stone path and lifting her into his arms. It felt right to be in his arms, held against his strong body. Their warm breaths created clouds in the air, heating both of their chilled, rosy faces. Vive had no time for his reprimand. Instead, she questioned him. "Why don't you want to see me home?" Her hand came to his face. "I was never supposed to meet you." He looked sorry and regretful. "Why?" She was sure he wouldn't answer, but as the seconds passed and the sound of melting snow dripped off the gazebo icicles, he exhaled, and she felt his body relax slightly. "Because I knew that I'd never stop wanting you." His eyes bore into hers. "Is that so wrong?" she said in a small voice, and a sad expression descended on his face, causing Vive to flinch. "You'd never be safe if you chose to associate with me." "You can protect me," she said with confidence. "I couldn't even protect you from falling last night," he said, bitterness in his growl. "If I were even a fraction of my old self, you wouldn't have fallen." "You weren't there," she retorted. "I should have been able to sense you, but you were too far away, and without my powers—" He said it as if he were tasting poison. Vive thought hard, conjuring what she'd heard about the Fae. "You lost your powers?" "Not quite," he answered. He still held her, and now he used one hand to caress her cheek before he looked off behind her. "We draw our powers from Faeren and Earth, but when you've lived on another world too long, you start to lose your connection to Faeren. Earth, I don't draw the same amount of power from her." "Why do you live here?" Her voice was small, as if he was a wild animal and she was trying not to scare him off.
I was banished here a long time ago. The king took my powers to leave.
His voice had a rasp of emotion, and Vive knew there was much more to this wound. Instead of pressing him further, she took his face in her hand and pulled him to face her once again. She rested her cheek against his and said, "I want to see you again. Don't let this be the last time."
I don't think that I could stay away.
He was intrigued by this woman who walked in his forest. She never walked with anyone and was quiet and respectful of the forest. Sometimes she would laugh to herself about something, or have a smile on her face, some secret inside her mind that he would never know. He wondered what she was thinking, what made her happy. Sometimes, when she thought she was alone, she would talk to the trees, plants, and animals of the forest. They enjoyed her soothing voice, and he found that he did as well. Some days she had a dark cast on her face, lost in thought. Sometimes it was frustration or sadness. He watched over her in curiosity. She often stopped to paint a piece of the forest, and the trees and other subjects tried to hold still, even trying to influence her angle to get their good side. Other times, she would sit in the forest and write in her little notebook, scribbling drawings and stories and thoughts of the day. Then one day she fell, and his will to stay impartial crumbled.